Hey guys, this is Chad Jadis, and you're listening to The Art of Suffering. Our mess becomes God's message. In St. Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, he makes a shocking statement to the primary audience in which his exhortation is addressed, by proclaiming that the body of each individual person is so sacred that it is the temple of the Holy Spirit, the dwelling place of the living God. This spiritual giant in Christian history proclaims, the body, however, is not for immorality, but for the Lord, and the Lord is for the body. God raised the Lord and will raise us up by his power. Do you not know that your bodies are members of Christ? Shall I then take Christ's members and make them a member of a prostitute? Of course not. Or do you not know that anyone who joins himself to a prostitute becomes one body with her? For the two, it says, will become one flesh. But whoever is joined to the Lord becomes one spirit with him. Avoid immorality. Every other sin a person commits is outside the body, but the immoral person sins against his own body. Do you not know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit within you, whom you have from God, and that you are not your own? For you have been purchased at a price. Therefore, glorify God in your body. The cultural confusion spreading throughout society about the nature of what it means to be human is a relentless attack on the mind of God, the person of God, and the authority of God. The intentional normalization of ideas like gender fluidity, transgenderism, bisexuality, and homosexuality by cancel culture and its woke ideological counterparts are in direct contradiction with human nature and the divine origins of its purposeful design. These concepts, which are moral by their nature, have also been politically weaponized and are successfully undermining traditional Judeo-Christian God-given revelations on family, marriage, and the human person. Those who find themselves confused over their sexual identity and have emotional attachments to this well-constructed and promoted lie may have found a quick but eventually empty fix to a longing in their human heart that can only be fulfilled in their unity with the Word incarnate, Jesus Christ. Tragically, modern philosophy has done a better job explaining a distorted view of a human person than we have sharing a divinely revealed reality about what it means to be human as Roman Catholics. As St. Augustine said, our hearts will be restless, Lord, until they rest in you. Before my radical reversion to the Catholic faith in 2008, I had a very shallow and inaccurate understanding of a beautiful teaching from a prophetic pope. Theology of the body can be wrongly interpreted as a talk about the conjugal act within marriage from a Catholic worldview. Over the past decade, I have studied, taught, and shared the entirety of this teaching while coming to understand how wrong that initial impression can be. Typically within marriage preparation courses, some talking points from this immense teaching are used when couples are given an introduction to a natural way to plan their family, rather than embracing artificial contraception. Without the entire teaching, they are not aware of how the human person was created primarily for communion with God, and then in the secondary way, for communion with his or her spouse and others. Unfortunately, this timeless gift is lost when we view love through the lens of sex, rather than viewing human sexuality through the lens of authentic self-giving love. A human person consists of a unique body-soul composite that mirror the internal exchange of self-giving love found within the communion of persons within the triune God. St. John Paul II states in Love and Responsibility, his blueprint for theology of the body, that the true measure of love we have for someone is the responsibility we're willing to take for them. In fact, man cannot fully find himself except through a sincere gift of himself. Gaudium Et Spes, a Vatican II document, states this. Expanding that concept, he insists the opposite of love is not hate, but use, revealing that a person can never be the means to an end for another, because doing so reduces someone to an object. Therefore, it is the task of every person, male or female, to preserve the dignity of their neighbor. Through developing the virtues of modesty and chastity within our lives, we are conditioned to love people and use things, rather than to use people while loving things. Cultural trends demand that we be reminded that we belong to God, not to the world. This will allow us the freedom to discover the gift of communion with others that meets the deepest desires of our humanity and builds stronger relationships among individuals and families in a world that desperately needs it. Today I'm joined by an amazing couple who has appeared previously on the show to discuss their journey with their special needs child. This time, they're here to share their journey from a marriage of maintenance to one of mission that shares in their baptismal call to pass on this great gift to future generations of Catholics. That task begins not by approaching theology of the body as information learned at a marriage encounter, but rather something actively lived and a witness within a fallen world. Dan and Emily K. Whiting reside in Northeast Ohio. Emily, who was embarked on a public speaking ministry, was born and raised Catholic, but it wasn't until college that she encountered Jesus on a personal level while attending Ohio State University. There, she earned a bachelor's degree in agricultural communications with training in journalism and marketing. She is a student of Pope St. John Paul II's Theology of the Body and infuses these truths in all of her ministry work. Dan and Emily are the proud parents of 3 beautiful children and are here today to share their journey with Theology of the Body and tremendous benefit it has had in their marital bond. Well, guys, sorry for the long intro, but I'm kind of giving a background on what TOB is all about since we're going to kind of break it down. It's great to have you back. How are y'all doing today?
Fantastic. It's great to be back, Chad. Thank you so much for inviting us.
Now, I remember when we filmed an episode not that long ago where you guys were sharing your beautiful journey with your daughter, Charlotte, and all the challenges you guys have had in that. And it's really great to have you back here today. We've kind of had a couple of exchanges where you and I talked about the layout for this program. I know how passionate you are about TOB.
Yes.
And I really believe that there needs to be a larger portion of people in the world today witnessing the beauty of that in their married life. So thank you both for being here, and thank you for your willingness to share that journey with us.
Absolutely. It's an honor. It's humbling. And it's something that, once you learn more about it, you can't keep it to yourself because it's so beautiful.
No, and it really does give you, I think, the average person, if you take the time to learn it, a vocabulary, an adequate one, to have these kind of conversations with people in everyday encounters, which a lot of times, if you don't have a vocabulary for this or you don't have a background in it, trying to address these issues, usually if you're a Christian by the modern world, is pretty much misunderstood and labeled in a way that I don't think is very productive for a conversation. So my hope in doing this podcast with you guys and being able to share it with others is to get them, A, interested in learning more about theology of the body, and then B, giving them some kind of vocabulary or talking points that they can use in a conversation when they're confronted about these things as Catholic Christians that makes them comfortable in the conversation and not feel like they're going to get labeled as a hate group or people that are, judging people. It's not anything like that. It's just simply saying, let's take an objective look at what it means to be human. And can we come to an agreement on what that's all about? And if that's the case, then there's a specific purpose for humanity. And when we don't fulfill that purpose because of the way we were designed, we're not going to be fulfilled in our humanity.
Absolutely. And it paints the world into such, when you understand what Pope John Paul II was teaching in Theology of the Body, all of a sudden the world becomes beautiful and bright in a whole new way. You get to see the world in the way that God intended it to be. And it brings, for lack of a better word, it brings the world to life in a whole new light. And it makes it, it's not confrontational at all. Now it's just a conversation of bringing us to Christ even more, so it's beautiful and it gets me very fired up.
No, I'm glad. And, we talk about, there's a lot of talking heads. I don't know, it's kind of a pejorative, but I don't mean it that way, that are out there that give a great explanation of theology of the body. Jason Everett's one of them that I know with the Chastity Project, him and his wife. Brian Butler here in my archdiocese, the Archdiocese of New Orleans, which is near my diocese in Lafayette, Louisiana, does a lot with his ECHO program. He was kind of involved in helping produce the U program for Ascension Press.
Fantastic.
And of course, there's Christopher West, who I'm sure you guys are very familiar with. And there's some folks in my diocese who are very familiar with Christopher West and his approach. And I love his analogy. I think you and I talked about it briefly the last time we had a kind of like a powwow before getting together. But he basically says God wants to marry you, each one of us. And that's really what this whole thing is all about. And if you look at sacred scripture and you start in Genesis and you go all the way through Revelation, you see that God forms a covenant bond with a married couple in Genesis. And the Bible begins with a wedding and it ends with one. And it's about God's journey throughout salvation history of taking a bride who he had wed himself to, who had committed several infidelities by worshiping other gods and breaking away from his covenant. And basically what he wants to do is purify that bride completely so that one day he can reunite himself through one universal covenant to that bride for all eternity. And we say Christ is the head, we are his body, the body of Christ is the bride of Christ. So Christ the bridegroom, we the bride have to be united. And I don't think most people see that connection between those two things and what we are as individuals in our humanity. One of the things that we talked about too was that you can see the triune nature of God within each person. I think that part kind of gets lost in the understanding of this because it's so focused on the one flesh indissoluble union of marriage when you get to that part of the teaching. But if you don't do the first part, then the second part doesn't have as much teeth, I don't think, a lasting part of it, you know?
Right.
So I'm going to start with you, since I know that you go around kind of like a TOB guru in your area, and you kind of try to share this beautiful message with people. So when we talk about TOB and we talk about humanity, John Paul II does a really incredible thing. He lays out in his teaching what we call like 3 stages of manhood. He calls them the original man, historical man, and then this big theological term, this eschatological man. And it's basically just talking about where a man was before the fall, where a man is now after the fall, and where a man intends to be forever with God in eternity. So maybe you could kind of just, since you're a guru in TOB, could you kind of give a little breakdown of that for the audience in your own words and your way of explaining it? It's fine with me, but can you do that for us?
I'd be thrilled. Thanks, Chad.
Sure.
And I love the combination of the 3 of us between Dan, Chad, and I, because, you know, Dan is so wise about how this is all lived out. And I'm the one who's like got my nose in the book, reading all, you know, the things that Pope John Paul II has taught. And you are a teacher, Chad, right? So it's just really fun to see how the 3 of us can come to the table and bring it all together. So I know Dan's been quiet thus far, and I know he's going to jump in with incredible wisdom soon enough. I love when I get to do things with Dan, because the things he says is always just like mic drop, you know. He basically wraps up what we were going to say in, you know, a few words, and it's awesome. So just grateful to be able to do it together. So to your question, it's this big word called anthropology, right? It's the study of human history and who we are as human beings. And I'll be honest, when I first heard of theology of the body, I was really thrown off when people would say, oh, well, you know, it's discovering the meaning of life, love, sex, and gender. And I'm like, what do those have anything to do with each other? You know, because coming from the worldview, love, sex, gender has nothing to do with God. At least that's what I thought. And it's so mind-boggling that that's what I used to think, because that is so absolutely wrong. And so it's been really fun getting to learn theology of the body. And honestly, what led us to it, Dan and I lived it out by just learning the hard way and kind of trying to grow in our faith and figure out what the heck are we supposed to do with all these desires God gave us? Why did he create male and female? All those big questions. And it led us to discovering some of these truths before we even heard about theology of the body. And then Pope John Paul II gave us the words to say, that's what we were experiencing. That makes so much sense now. So, you know, we talk about this history of mankind. And at first, if you're listening and you think, what does that have to do with the topic at hand? It has everything to do with the topic at hand. But stick with us, because at first it doesn't make sense, right? So anthropology, basically, we're talking about what Chad was introducing of original man, historical man, and eschatological man. I probably screwed up how to say that. So I'm going to put it in my own words. Design, desire, destiny. Actually, I don't think those are my words. I think those are Christopher West's. But regardless, if you look at the first 2 chapters of Genesis, it is a poem written by Moses for the people to better understand the heart of God and how and why he created creation, right? And the first 2 chapters really help us understand what was God's intended design for humankind. And so we get this vision of Adam and Eve walking through the garden in great unity with God, and God was walking with them. And, you know, Adam and Eve, it literally says Adam and Eve were naked and unashamed. And that is such a beautiful phrase. I love it so much. It has so many meanings. You know, were they literally naked and unashamed? Who knows? But the point is they were totally exposed to God in their deepest being. They were seen by God and they saw him. And that's the desire of our heart, right? St. Augustine, you quoted him earlier, and I'm going to quote him too. He says, the deepest desire of the human heart is to see another and be seen by that other's loving gaze. And that's what they had back in the Garden of Eden. And they had this great love between each other of Adam and Eve, and between Adam and Eve and God. And then insert the fall, which would be sin, right? Freedom. And love can't be true love without freedom, right? If we don't have the choice to say, no, I don't want it, well, then that's not love, that's slavery. And so God was so loving that he gave us this freedom of choice, and now insert sin. We tend to choose to walk away from God, right? And yet our hearts have this deep longing that were planted in us from the beginning in our design to want that complete unity with each other and with God. So we have our design, what we were intended to be, and that was in complete unity with each other and complete unity with God in the Garden of Eden. And then we have the fall. And so now we're in kind of the second phase of human history, which is where we live right now. And that's historical man, or the fallen and redeemed, or what I like to call, or maybe Christopher West, I'm pretty sure, desire. We're living in this space of desire, right? Where we have fallen, we've chosen to sin and to separate ourselves from God. And yet we still have this burning desire for him, and literally nothing satisfies, right? We can chase power, we can chase money, we can chase love, we can chase, family, we can chase money, whatever it is. But at the end of the day, it never fully satisfies. And what's really awesome about our Catholic faith is our Catholic faith teaches those desires are not bad, because ultimately they're meant to point you toward God. It's when those desires invert you and point you the wrong direction that it becomes bad, right? That it can become sinful. But like, my desire for a really yummy cookie is not bad as long as I don't eat 10 of them, because ultimately one yummy cookie is not going to satisfy me. It's just going to point me to the banquet I'm headed toward in heaven. So we're stuck in this moment of desire, but the good news is we are redeemed, right? We just celebrated Christmas. Jesus came, he entered into our space of being fallen humanity, and he redeemed it. He has risen, and he's gone before us, preparing a space for us as his bridegroom. And so we are headed toward our destiny, or the eschatological man, where we're going to go when we're in heaven to be completely united with him. And I remember at our marriage prep, we were taught, what is the goal of marriage? Well, it's ultimately to help each other get to heaven. And at the time, that totally blew my mind. It really rocked my world. But now I'm starting to see it more and more, because we are meant to help be a sign to point our spouse in the direction of the destiny of where we're going. And that's complete unity with God. And if marriage of the Lamb, marriage of the groom and the bridegroom is the goal, then this marriage here on earth is such a beautiful sign to help point us there, right? But it is not the end goal. It is the sign. Like, if I'm going to travel west, I don't stop at the sign that says this way goes west and say, I'm there. I'm not there yet. I just got to the sign. And the sign is to point me there. So we have the design of how we were created to be. Then we have fallen and redeemed, and we're kind of living in this, muck and mire of desire. But ultimately, if we can see those desires for what they were meant to be in the original design, we can allow them to point us toward our destiny of being completely united with Christ.
Yes, that's beautiful. And as I was listening to you break those three things down, I love those three analogous words you used. Design, desire, and then destiny, because that's a beautiful way of breaking down those three parts of that teaching. It's also reminding me of the idea of original unity and original solitude, which we find in the first part, where Adam, after being created, knows he's made for communion, right? But he's alone. He looks at the rest of creation. He sees that there's nothing compatible with him in his nature, because his full union is first with God, but now he desires to express that in his humanity. And God, in his loving mercy, then says, okay, well, I'm going to give you a partner who's suitable for you. And he creates the woman, and then Adam and Eve come together. And of course, that one flesh, indissoluble union that God unites in the covenant bond, once again, represents for us, as you said beautifully, a sign that points to the eternal unity we all are destined to have with God for all eternity. And I think a lot of people misunderstand the idea that your total fulfillment as an individual has to come first and foremost with your unity with God. Even though you may have been blessed to have a spouse who is going to be a beautiful partner for you, you have to have that initial understanding. So no matter what you pursue, like you said, you're not going to fulfill your desire if you're trying to fulfill it with everything but God. So we have a God-sized hole, right? And unfortunately, we try to fill it with everything but God, and we don't ever seem to do it
right.
To our own satisfaction. So, and now, we're moving on here. Dan, do you have any thoughts about those three things when you came across them from Theology of the Body that really stuck out to you when you first heard that as a man?
Yeah, certainly going back to our marriage prep and where we've come from, going into marriage prep, being unsure of where God fit into our sexual relationship, to now, even sexual relationship, really, our relationship in general. It took a path in my life to bring out what I knew was always there, or to put into action the calling, what I would say back then, the feelings that I had inside me that I didn't know how to express them. I now come to understand that they were calling from God, a longing of God to be in a relationship with me, a closer relationship with me through that was made more beautiful with Emily. So what do I mean by that? It went from me not wanting to take advantage or be selfish with Emily. I just knew in my heart I didn't want to be that way, say before marriage or before marriage prep or as we started this journey. I didn't want to be selfish with Emily, to now coming to understand that true love from God is made beautiful through marriage by being self-giving. Going through coming to understand TOB, to me, the most impactful thing was nothing really about sex, nothing really about the worldly view or the shallow view of what TOB is by, I'll term them as from our haters, but coming to understand that what was in my heart, what God was calling me, what he was whispering, or what he was screaming to me that I heard as a whisper was, you're right, Dan. The golden rule is made true or exposed through TOB. You don't want to be selfish with Emily because you don't want anybody to be selfish with you. And I came to understand that myself, can get closer to God through the gift of marriage by being selfless. God's calling us to be selfless, ultimately to him, to serve him, but that is put in practice in my life through loving Emily selflessly. And that's maybe a witness of the joy I find through selflessly loving Emily, as imperfect as I do that. The world, our culture is saying you will find joy in being selfish, ultimately selfish. They put lipstick on it to say it's going to feel good being selfish in a variety of ways. But I think what you ultimately find through TOB, through applying TOB to your marriage, is that the more selfless you become, the more joy you find. That's what I'm ultimately trying to say, is the more I find myself giving ultimately to God, but through marriage, through to Emily, the more joy I'm finding. And when I can tell I've been selfish, the pain or the disappointment I have in myself is not fun. So, yeah. Maybe that was a real long explanation of how I feel, my journey through TOB with Emily and God. So.
That was beautiful. I'm thinking as you're talking, I'm listening to you express all those three things that we're talking about in a very down-to-earth, easy way for any layperson to be able to understand, and everything you said is completely true. To me, this becomes almost a great, how we do examinations of consciences individually when we're going to think about what we need to do to go to confession, right, as Catholics. Well, to me, this is almost a great, TOB is almost, it's the first time I've ever saying this, but it just, your whole layout kind of brought it to my mind. It's a great examination of conscience for your marriage. Just to look at it as, where is my marriage? How healthy is it? Unhealthy is it? What are the beautiful things that we're doing right? What are the things we need to work on? I know that Emily had a lot of knowledge of TOB before. We had talked about that in the past. But when you implement it, you say it brought about an idea of a self-gift, an idea of outwardly looking for other, and that brought the joy that comes in the union you have with that person, which, as you guys have kind of said, points to the union we're all destined to have with God. So, I'm thinking now, looking back on my own marriage and listening to you, Dan, that some of the greatest acts of love I've shown my wife have not been physical. They're non-physical acts. For me, my wife has tremendous migraine headaches. It's just something she gets periodically where she comes home from working at the hospital and around certain points of the month, she gets a really bad headache and she just cannot get out of bed. And the whole care of the 3 children falls on my back. So for me, the greatest act of love I can show in that moment is to be selfless and to sacrifice so that she can do what she needs to do physically to get herself back into a place where she can be present to our kids and be a wife and a mom to me. Mm-hmm. That's just in my situation. But we talked about non-physical acts of love are some of the greatest things you can do, not only inside a marriage, but before marriage. So what kind of impact practically has implementing the teachings of chastity and natural family planning, which is something a lot of people don't like to talk about, but because they don't understand it, how does that like transform your marriage, right? From like that idea of, like you were stating, like from being selfish to being completely selfless.
I'll jump in with just some background. So, where I guess I struggled, and I'm just being super honest, where I struggled when I was learning theology of the body was how is learning the history of man related to now us living selflessly, And so just to kind of help bring that, just maybe some other people are tuned in and like, wait, I don't understand how that connects. So I'll help you because I didn't either. So bottom line is, if we are created to be in complete union with God and we are created as image bearers of Christ, it says that several times in 1st and 2nd Genesis, right? We are the image bearers of Christ. We make visible the invisible love of God. That's the thesis statement of theology of the body. Our bodies make visible the invisible love of God, right? Well, if we make visible the invisible love of God, well, what are the characteristics of the love of God that we can then embody, right? And those characteristics, as Pope John Paul II very wonderfully put, was it's freely, totally, faithfully, and fruitfully loving, right? And so what does that mean? Well, freely means I give myself completely to you. And you'll see how this relates to marriage, because in marriage, you stand up there, you say, I do. I give you everything. I give you my finances, my time, my heart, my life, my broken hip when I'm 80, all of it, Totally. I give you myself completely. And this is exactly how Christ lived, right? He gave himself totally freely. We didn't ask for him. We didn't even want him. We killed him, and he gave himself anyway. And he gave his life completely, freely, totally. And then faithfully, he's been so faithful to us. You read, the Old Testament, and it's just us being unfaithful over and over and over. And he just stays there with us and says, come on, I still love you. Come on, And then fruitfully, so being open to life, because when there is love, it begets life. That's the nature of God, and we are invited as image bearers of Christ to do the same. And that's where it's beautiful as male and female, because whether we are uniting just together and it's not going to result in a child, or we unite and it does result in a child, either way, we're begetting life because two become one, and we're creating a new life between these two. So that's why it leads us to saying self-gift is true love, because that's what freely, totally, faithfully, fruitfully, that's living it out, right? God is a complete self-gift. He gives himself to us every single day in so many ways. And that's the invitation in marriage, is to do the same to each other. And ultimately that's going to help us be more fulfilled. So that's just a little like academic background. And now I'm going to mute myself so Dan can apply it to real life.
Go for it.
Okay. So 2 things I wanted to touch on was, first thing is maybe going back a little bit to the first conversation we were in, but tying it into this, making our relationship with God, living out TOB as more than just an academic study, but in reality, bringing forth those words into our relationship, putting those words into action. I guess just an example might be with Emily and I, where, we have the challenges with Charlotte, and Emily also has a calling to bring to life God's word, bring to life theology of the body, and what it means for those around us, and being myself trying to be self-giving and being trying to live out my part of the relationship of our marriage and being joyful doing it. When we had Charlotte, it was right around the time that Emily was really becoming engrossed in developing her ministry, forming that ministry, and also the amount of time that she needs to, that somebody needs to put forth to manage Charlotte's care. We had a lot of conversations about how to move forward, and ultimately we decided that it would be best if Emily stepped away from the career she was developing outside of the family, outside of the ministry, to be able to focus on Charlotte and developing the ministry. And it brought, to support that, I am the primary source of income for us at this point. The fact was that I had to work and she had to manage Charlotte's care, and she was also going to develop the ministry. So what I experienced throughout that time from then until now is my career brought on a new meaning, and I have a new appreciation for my career, a new joy in my career, not only the satisfaction it gives me from showing up every day at work and doing the actual work, but also knowing that it's supporting our family and being able to support Emily, not only taking care of our child, our nuclear family, but also taking care of God's children in developing this ministry. So it just brought forth a whole new appreciation for my career, knowing what it was providing. So I think that's maybe a witness to where theology of the body and developing that relationship with God through our marriage has brought me in my career. So
okay, so as you're speaking, I'm thinking about, we titled this thing "Male and Female He Created Them." What you just gave was a complete witness to what the authentic design of masculinity is all about. The fact that men are designed to provide and to protect and to secure order, right, within the domestic church, which is your home, where you act as the high priest. And then Emily, in her design in motherhood, which is such a big part of that design, is to nurture and to provide that atmosphere at home that allows the development of not only your children, but also other people's children, as she proclaims that femininity, authentic femininity, in her role as mother, but also as somebody who goes out and shares the message of theology of the body. And then to piggyback off of the other thing you guys were talking about, she mentioned total, free, fruitful, and faithful. And the way that I sell that to people when I share TOB is that it's just authentic love's measuring stick compared to a counterfeit love, because counterfeit love doesn't speak to those four things. Counterfeit love is focused on self. It's not total, it's not free, it's not fruitful, and it's certainly not faithful. But an authentic love always does that. And Christ exhibited those four things on the cross at Calvary when he made himself totally, freely, fruitfully, and faithfully available to his spouse, us, the bride of Christ, right? So what you're speaking of in layman's terms is taking those theological ideas and bringing them to real life and applying them within a marriage, within the role of male and the role of female, and how God ordered it that way so that we could find true fulfillment with him first, but then also make visible, as you said so beautifully, Emily, at the beginning of the podcast, that which is invisible, which is that communion of persons, which is authentically and eternally exchanging self-giving love and begetting new life, whether it's biological life, like you mentioned, when you bring about a child, or it's spiritual life, because the union of man and woman, even if it doesn't result in, as you said earlier, a biological life, it results in spiritual union between the two of you. And it's no different than the spiritual life that comes from the love that a celibate man who has embraced the priesthood is giving to his parishioners as their quote unquote spiritual father, as the bridegroom, standing in the person of the bridegroom and now married to the bride. He's just already kind of exhibiting what we're all destined for eternally, which is what our marriage covenant bond and our conjugal act within that bond points to for everybody else. So the whole idea of authentic love, man, that's to me, like, that's what that y'all just laid that out. He just witnessed to that in a way anybody could understand. So
I told you,
I didn't mean
Dan
to
is
like
the man
jump
of
in, but
wisdom.
No, that was good. And I didn't mean to jump in and interrupt you, but so maybe Dan, if you got your second point now, you can roll with it. I just wanted to throw that in because it was so beautifully articulated.
Do you mind, Dan, if I interject one other thing too?
No, Emily, go ahead, please. I love the back and forth. This is great.
Yeah, and then I'll pass it back to Dan because I want to hear your second point because, like I said, they're always amazing. So I wanted to jump in. Chad, you said, and I'm going to totally butcher it the way you said it was beautiful, but you were talking about the man's role and the female's role in masculinity and femininity. And I just want to jump in because if you're a listener and you just bristled at that, I want to just meet you right there because that's a totally natural reaction to bristle because welcome to the world. This is the world we live in. But here's the teaching, and it's so beautiful when it's unfolded, because I would have been one, and you're probably sensing a trend here, where I absolutely would have bristled at that even just 2 years ago. I'm like, wait a minute, I don't need provided for. I can provide for myself. I have a career of my own, and I'm quite capable and all those things. And yes, that's all true. And there's nothing wrong with a woman working, all of those things. However, male and female were created differently in a beautiful accenting way. And so whether I'm still working and Dan's the one at home with kids or not, that's not the point. The point is that, all nature points to the reality of God. So if you look at the nature of male and female, if we're talking about how male and female are united, male gives the gift, right, of life. Female receives. Female says, yes, I'm willing to receive. I will accept that gift. And we're talking about in the conjugal act, right? That is, again, a sign, a symbol, of an example of the kind of relationship that God created us for when he talks about being the groom and the bridegroom, where Jesus wants to give the love and the church receives it and says, yes, I receive it. And now I give it back to you because I love you so much too. And so that's this back and forth love. And so as a male, you have the beautiful and high calling to initiate, right? Like, it's even in our culture where the roles of male and female are totally blurred, it is still accepted across most anyone that the male should pop the question for engagement, right? Why? Why is that? Well, it's because deep inside our bones, we know that the man has been designed to be the one to reach out, to do the first step. And then the female either accepts or doesn't. And then it's this reciprocal relationship. So I probably have butchered in explaining this, but bottom line is it's not something to be afraid of when we talk about the man being, the head of the household. That's perfectly fine because that just means that if you are resembling this love of God and you're truly living it out, it just means you're the one that's the first to lay your life down and say, I give myself to you. Will you give yourself to me too? That's the goal, right? And so living femininity and masculinity out just means that the male is the example of Christ in the house, where he lays his life down first and the woman receives. And that doesn't mean it doesn't flip-flop plenty of times, right? But it's this reciprocal love that we're invited into as male and female, and nature always brings to light the reality of God if you can just stop long enough to look at it and see it with open eyes, right? Open the eyes of our hearts, Lord.
Yes, and you're just simply putting into layman's terms what Paul writes about in Ephesians, where he says, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church. Purify them, make them, beautiful, so that when you unite yourself to them, they are pure and undefiled. And that's by making the same self-sacrifice for your family that he did on the cross. So, people are like, well, what is masculinity? And I'm going to say well, have you looked at a cross lately? Have you looked at the crucifix? Men, that is authentic. There is no more authentic masculinity than what you see in the person of Jesus Christ. Dan, please.
Yeah.
We talked too much. Fill us in, man. Give us your second point. I'm sorry we kind of went off on a tangent there, but it was I think it was well put.
Yeah, I'm just sitting back and listening to everything, and I think my second point had to do with tying together a lot of the terms we use. I spoke with it a little bit before we started this podcast with Emily. If you're a listener out there and you think you're hearing a lot of terms and a lot of, hopefully you're not hearing a lot of terms and being spoken to from a, worldly view of these terms. If you're hearing things like chastity and purity, and you kind of cringe, Emily and I kind of cringe when we use those terms in her ministry because of the worldly view or the world. When you hear those words, where does the worldly mind go? It goes to rules. Well, what we really want to bring forth with Emily's ministry is the life-giving relationship. And what the life-giving relationship is, what does the picture of your life look like with these words infused into them, these points infused into them? What does your church look like when it goes from being the place you go every Sunday to the place you develop that relationship with God in? It goes from, how is that painting made beautiful of your life? It's when there's an active relationship with God. All these things we've talked about today. I guess I'm hoping that the listener, comes away with a better way to find a relationship with God, not trying to understand what each one of these terms mean, what chastity means technically, but how do you put these words into action in your life? How do you put these words into action in developing that relationship with God? Because if you go to church every Sunday because you're supposed to, I think you need to dive deeper into talking to God, developing that relationship with God to the point you find yourself wanting to go to church every Sunday. That was a big change in my life, going from being taken to church every Sunday, to a certain point in high school where I wanted to go to church every Sunday, and then having to refine that out in college when there were no people around saying, are you going to go to church or not? I had to develop that relationship with God further throughout college to come back to the desire to go to church because it developed my relationship with God. I think that was the second point I wanted to make.
This is a great transition, because my next question was talking about the elephant in the room. That's kind of making what is chastity really? So the way you articulated that is great, because it is a misunderstood term. Okay, priests are celibate. That means they have lifelong continence. They're not going to ever engage in the conjugal act. They bypass that for the greater good, which is to be in union with God, which we all are designed to be in eventually. And that's why priests are celibate, because Jesus Christ himself was celibate. The teaching on chastity and celibacy goes back to the person of Jesus Christ. Everything that's taught in the dogmatic sense or in a moral sense in the Catholic Church can be rooted back into the person of Jesus Christ, because he was the ultimate revelation, if you will, in the flesh when he took on human nature and came into the world to make those things visible to humanity. But chastity is not celibacy. It's a lot different. Okay, so I'm a married man, you're a married man, and Emily's a married woman, and we have to practice chastity. My wife Ashley has to practice chastity inside of our marriage to make our marriage stronger, to make it better, so that we can fulfill what John Paul II said about the measure which you love someone is the responsibility you want to take for them. It stops you from objectifying someone and making them an object to be used. It creates a mindset that allows you to see the whole person, body and soul, that should be loved as a gift that has been given to you by God, and that should be received, and to see yourself as a gift created by God that's been given to your spouse. But that also permeates in the single life and to other people. Because if you're living a chaste life as a single person and you're in complete union with God, you can make a gift of yourself to other people in many, many ways that I said earlier reflects that non-physical act of love that even supersedes that act of physical love that you express in the conjugal act. And I think there's a big misunderstanding about what chastity is and why it should be lived out, and why it leads to total fulfillment. And that applies to everybody across the board, whether they're married or they're single or whatever their state of life is, right? As a Catholic. It's hard to embrace because we live in, I hate to say it, but a pornified culture where everything is overly sexualized. And it's like sexuality has been so distorted. Emily, you mentioned earlier about inverting reality, things being seen one way when they should be seen the other way. And you just articulated a few minutes ago, Dan, that the world hears these words and they say, oh, you're a prude or you're following rules. And it's like, no, what you're saying is, in this moment, I choose to love and reciprocate, as you said earlier so beautifully, Emily. Let me reciprocate the love to God in this moment that he's first shown to me. And I'm choosing to reciprocate that love out of love for God, not out of spite for my own natural desires or the person next to me. In fact, chastity, I always tell people, is more about the person next to you than it is about you, because it's always looking out what's best for them. Whereas abstinence, the way that the world defines this term, is more about, well, I need to self-preserve, right? I don't want to get a sexually transmitted disease, or I don't want to put myself in harm's way, or I don't want to get, oh my goodness, I don't want to have a disease. I don't want to get pregnant. By the way, pregnancy is not a disease. It's not a medical condition. It's a gift.
No, it's not.
Okay, so like, you follow what I'm saying? And there's people that have bought into these terms, and they bring all that, and I remember this is kind of leading me into that idea where Jesus says, remain in me, you can do all things. Apart from me, you can do nothing. So I'm the vine, you are the branches. How do we remain in him? Well, theology of the body points to that union God wants with man and woman. And where is that climaxed in the liturgy? It's climaxed in the reception of Holy Communion, because that's what it's representing. The bridegroom, Jesus Christ, being in complete communion, whole self, totally, freely, fruitfully, and faithfully giving himself to us. And we're now going to give ourselves back to him. So it says on Calvary, consummato est, he's consummated the new covenant, right? So he's consummated that marriage, and that marriage bond God wants to marry you is being done in that moment. So if we want to remain chaste and remain fulfilled, we cannot, I say in our fallen nature, we cannot do that outside of our relationship with God, which Dan just talked about, the secondary part of that relationship within a marriage of a spouse, also within a relationship between a platonic friend who you honor and love platonically, whether that's a male and female platonic relationship as a friendship, or it's a male and male friendship, or a female and female friendship. It needs to be honored that way, and it needs to be exhibited that way. And those invisible communion we have with one another becomes visible, right? With us living that out in the world. And it also points to the invisible communion we have with God. So chastity is really not, I mean, I don't mean to go on a rant on this, but I get so frustrated because it is the most misunderstood term. Chastity is the key to having life and having it to the full. Would y'all agree with that?
It's interesting you say this, Chad, and I love how fired up you get. So here's been my approach, and I don't know that it's the right one, but in my ministry, I honestly don't even use the word chastity, and it's because it is so misunderstood. However, I could totally see the argument that it should be a redeemed word, so there's that. But if you look at, so either way, you could do either one. But if you reframe it or kind of put new words to it, I was looking up the definition this morning. Basically, it's turning up to God with your desires, specifically sexual, but in general, turning up to God with your desires for his self-giving love, right? So here's an example of chastity. I'm in the grocery store. I see another guy walking down the aisle, and he's handsome, and he's really good with his kids. And I can't help but be like, oh. And that's a thought that just goes through my head before I can even control it, right? But then to be chaste, I can instantly counter that thought by going, you know what, God? That guy is a beautiful creation of you. He is an image of your, love. And thank you, God, for making wonderful men like him. And then I can move on rather than beating myself up and being like, oh my gosh, I totally just objectified him. And did I just betray my husband? And then I can come home and be like, Dan, guess what just happened? I was going through the grocery store and I saw this guy and this thought went through my head, blah, blah, blah. And then it creates this beautiful trust because Dan and I are sharing like, hey, I had this thought that probably wasn't a great one. But at the root of it, it's good because I see beauty in that person, right? And he is beautiful because he's a creation of God. And so chastity really is, and I used to think, oh, I have to be chastity, it's the belt with the lock, right? No. Oh my gosh, that's what you think. And it's so far from that. It is an openness to the beauty of God. It is an openness to say, wow, yeah, the world we live in is beautiful. The people around me are beautiful, and I don't want to objectify them. And my sinful nature is going to try. And so I'm going to turn that to God and say, hey, God, I know I have this strong desire. This person is beautiful. I give it to you. And so even within marriage, it's like I can easily, heck, I objectify Dan every day accidentally, right?
Sure.
And being able to take that and be like, hey, God, I bring this to you because I know he's human. He can never fulfill me. He can never really be all that I need. And that's okay because he never was meant to be. He was meant to point me to you. So I see Dan has something to say, so I'll stop.
Yeah. So
that was beautiful.
Yes, it was. And it reminded me, Emily and I talked a little bit before this podcast about, the painting of your life. And throughout college, when I was in college, I had a real hard time with either taking the blinders off and seeing the beauty of the painting God is putting in front of me, and doing exactly what Emily just said, looking at another woman and not objectifying her, but acknowledging the beauty that God put in her, and leaving it there and appreciating it for what it was, but not lusting after it. So there was a lot of blinders on either one way in not trying not to look at it, or, looking at it and becoming so lustful. So I think in that moment, in a lot of those moments, I needed to reach out more to God in prayer and examining why I felt maybe that guilt or that, disappointing denial. It kind of seemed like it was one way or the other. So if you're a listener out there and you feel one of those two extremes, I guess hopefully you've heard throughout this podcast, you've been given some strategies to, go to prayer with God, to understand those desires are from God. Certainly those desires to move forward with, taking the blinders off or pulling back that lust and seeing the true beauty that God has put in front of you, to see the pure beauty of the painting that you might see in black and white come to color, come to life, or to see that painting, or to see, the nature in the fall and in the winter that's dead, and, come to see it in the spring and the summer where it's filled out. And, that can be a reflection in your life. I guess that's where we're trying to point you, in that direction of beauty, in that direction of, yes, this world is beautiful if you develop that relationship with God. And yeah, that's what hopefully you're finding in this podcast.
Absolutely. You're talking about two of the strongest passions we have in our human nature, especially in our fallen state. So because we're in a fallen state, they're going to be kind of distorted. But the two greatest passions we have are to reproduce and to feed ourselves. And, these are natural inclinations. I'm trying to get my son, who's going through puberty and, in high school, not to be scrupulous about the fact that he's noticing beautiful women. I'm like, Ephraim, that is a normal thing, and it's a good thing. Okay. The thing that's distorted about it is the fact that we have chosen in our fallen nature to misuse it, and we look at it through the wrong lens. You're talking about seeing a painting turning from black or white to coming to full life. To me, this is where what your expressions of chastity, which is what you're talking about in both of these examples in a very down-to-earth way, become a magnifying glass for the light to shine through and show the beauty of what God intended for us to see about other people. I go to a health club. It's one of the top 10 health clubs in the country. I've been a fitness freak my entire life. There are women walking around that are not practicing modesty hardly at all anywhere. And it's hard to walk in and you guys are talking about, how did I see women? This is what I get out of what you talked about. How did I see the opposite sex before I was married, before I encountered TOB, to how do I see them now? And I wrote in my new book that I put out, Growing with Eli, Our Journey into Life and Light, when I discussed my marriage coming into the fullness of the faith with TOB and really having a chance to teach it and then see my wife in a different light than I did before, was, what I realized was when I stopped consciously objectifying my own spouse and realized the beautiful person she was and the gift she was, I stopped subconsciously objectifying every single person that I encountered. And you come to recognize those moments in the gym or in the grocery store, where you come to a self-awareness that, okay, I have an option here. I can give into that fleeting natural desire, which is good, and take it to an excess, which is not really good, or I can keep the mean where it needs to be and realize that my spouse is probably not the only beautiful person God ever created, and it's okay for me to acknowledge someone else's beauty. It's not okay for me to turn them into an object of my own desire for my own gratification. Yes. Then I've slipped out of the realm of authentic love into counterfeit love, and I'm not loving that person the way that I should be. And therefore, I'm not loving my spouse the way I should. So when I get home and you have those awesome conversations like you had, it just shows you that you can acknowledge that, yes, there are other beautiful people in the world. We should acknowledge their beauty. But I chose that with another. Does that make
Right.
sense? And I made a promise and fidelity to choose that with others. So don't beat yourself up if you notice a beautiful person. That's
Yes.
okay. And to me, theology of the body gives the perfect balance of that, where you can do that in a healthy way and acknowledge the beauty of another without ever going to the excess and abusing it. And that's the gift that's brought to my life and my marriage. And it looks like, based on the example you just gave, it's certainly done the same for you guys.
Yeah. And something that I'm going to steal this from Christopher West again. He talks about the stoic, the mystic, and the addict. So the stoic is kind of what we have learned in Catholicism, not because of the Catholic Church, but because of just the nature of teaching, that it's just, we're taught like, okay, suppress those desires, keep them in, hold on tight to any of those things, because if you express them, it's bad, right? So it's like, don't have sex outside of marriage. Don't do this. Don't do that. Don't do this. All these rules. And the rules are good because they're helping you build a relationship. But when you really focus on the rules and you miss the point of them, then we can be the stoic, right? And we become spiritually dead. So you got the stoic, then you've got the addict who's like, to heck with the rules. This is the pornographic culture, right? I'm just going to go and I'm going to do what I want because it feels good. And I'm going to, whatever. And I think Christopher West calls it the fast food diet. You can either go on the starvation diet as the stoic, or you can go on the fast food diet and eat a bunch of grease because you're hungry. You have all these desires. You need to satisfy them, or you want to. And then you kind of are like, well, now I still feel sick. Like, first I was stoic, I was holding myself back and I was so hungry. Now I was an addict and I've, been gluttonous and I'm still unhappy. Is there something in between? And the answer is yes. That's what theology of the body is. That's what chastity is. It is the mystic, or another word is another way to putting it, turning your desires toward God and saying, Lord, I have all these desires. They're good in the root of them. You created me with them because you wanted them to point me toward you. And so every time I feel this desire, I'm going to go back to that cookie. And I do this all the time. I eat one. Well, I'm not satisfied. I want 2 more. I want 3 more. I want 4 more. The other day I ate an entire row of cookies and I felt horrible afterwards. A whole row of Oreos. So I was first being the stoic, like, I'm not even going to have cookie. And then I'm like, no, I'm the addict. I eat 10. And then I'm like, well, crud, maybe I could have had 2 and it would have been fine.
Yes. Yes.
So there's this happy medium of the mystic. And what do we do with that? Basically, it just means when I have a desire and I feel it come up, and this requires a lot of self-awareness, like you were saying, Chad, then I can turn up to God and say, Lord, you gave me these desires, and at the root of them, they are good. Help me to turn them toward you. And that's where it becomes so beautiful within marriage, because when we turn them toward God, then he naturally turns us toward each other as well. And it's just becomes so beautiful, so on fire. And, something that we said at the beginning, we learned this the hard way in dating, that he can't be my God. He cannot satisfy me. He cannot make me, to the fullness of happiness. And I can't for him either. And quite frankly, if he ever expects me to, I will fail and make him really disappointed, right? And that's okay. And it's so freeing to be able to look at each other and be like, you're not everything that I need. And that's okay. I love you to pieces because you are everything God created you to be for me. And I'm everything God created me to be for you in order to help ourselves get to God. So I just went on a total rant, but there you go.
No, that is beautiful. And I'm going to just piggyback off that last point for single people that are hearing this, because you can listen to this and say, well, it just has to do with marriage. Absolutely not. If you're a single person and you are, for lack of a better word, you're turning the person into an idol. You think that if you have this person, and I don't care, okay, what your sexual orientation is. This is true for anybody. If you think that your fulfillment is going to come from somebody else on this life, like you just said, you have missed the point. And the point of theology of the body is to teach each one of us in our state of life, whether it's married, single, or religious, that our ultimate fulfillment is in God alone. And when we begin to idolize our spouse, our child, our job, whatever it is that we think is going to fulfill us, it's not going to be the ultimate fulfillment, because we were designed first and foremost in the image of God and the triune God that resides within each one of us to be in union with him. We must first find that union with him. We must have a healthy union with him. And then the way that we love him and the way that we reciprocate our love to him will now be flown out and brought out to every person we encounter. And yes, you are right. I can only love you for who God created you to be, and you're never going to be my ultimate fulfillment. I'm going to love you in your imperfections, because you know what? That's what marriage is about, right? Waking up every day and saying, I love you in all that you are, including your unlovable imperfections. And I am choosing today to embrace all of them again. And I mean, that's what a husband and wife do, but that's also what a single person does in a platonic friendship with other people. I'm going to love you in your imperfectness because of who you are. And you're not ever going to be everything there is to be for me. Only God can do that. To me, that is the gift of TOB for everybody, not just for people that are dating, not just for people that are going to pursue marriage, but what you said at the beginning. This is what it means to be human, ultimately.
Yeah. And it's so freeing to know, we're never going to be able to, we're not going to be fully satisfied and fully united with God until we're in heaven. But we continue to get closer and closer and closer to him as we learn to live out this selfless love. And it's a fun journey.
Oh, absolutely. And it's so countercultural. And maybe we can close with some thoughts from Dan. But Dan, like what we've been talking about is this utilitarian mentality that people have in society, and we turn it on other people. And this, you said it right so well. I mean, I'm with you every step of the way, man. In college, I had the same issues. In the early parts of my marriage, I had the same issues. If you're a guy and you almost are repressing, it seems like you're repressing your manhood, you're repressing your human sexuality. And it's like, no, this is just a healthy way to live it out. And I found a way to do that with my spouse. And that's the kind of love, right? The kind of love you guys are talking about sharing in marriage. That's the one that makes a marriage last 50 years and not 50 minutes.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, going through college, and now to a much lesser extent, I was always excited about sports and seeing all these athletes and watching Sports Center and seeing what they said. And now, especially with the way social media has developed and the way athletes use social media, it's much more about what's happening off the court maybe than what's happening on the court. And you contrast that with, that's what the worldly view of, masculinity. I see that a lot in sports and especially social media and, from a man's perspective, seeing these men pound their chests and, say, I did that. And, I got these stats and I'm going for this. And, the term GOAT is just, I cringe. It's making its way into commercials on TV and, it's driving me away from sports very quickly. And the performance of the Browns is an easy way to drive me away from sports. But, you said it earlier on when you said, you look at, I maybe just described the worldly masculine view, but the masculine view we should be looking at as men is Jesus, like you said, Jesus dying on the cross. That's ultimate love. That's ultimate masculinity. That is marriage lasting 50 years, not 15 minutes, is dying to yourself for your spouse, for your children, and most importantly, dying to yourself for the service of God. And I am very, very quickly coming to find the joy and the beauty of that. And our culture says that is wrong. That is what you want to run away from. That is why you don't want to have kids, is because you want to be able to do what you want to do. Well, I'm sorry, that seems fairly selfish to me and the opposite of dying on the cross. So that's just my reflection of what I think marriage and is to me, and what it's continuing to be developed by God as, and how I am much more satisfied and joyful as a married man now with three beautiful children and a fourth in heaven than I ever was as a single man or as a man married before children. So these gifts, God keeps showing me gifts that the world deems as slavery. The world, how often do we hear in the news the terms being enslaved in the United States? Most of the people in the United States are in the top 1% of earners in the world. So tell me exactly how we're being enslaved in America. So I guess if you're a listener out there and you don't have children and you have a desire for children, whether that's actual children that you have in or outside of marriage, or the children that you'll come to understand that are yours in the context of a religious life, priest or a holy woman, it's a beautiful thing. It's not what culture says it is in being a death sentence or a slavery sentence. It's the opposite.
It sets you free, huh? I'm going to use the word goat for one person and one person only. The greatest of all time was the humble man born in a stable in Bethlehem, who in the town where he was being prepared to be the food for eternal life from the tree of life, which was the cross. And that was Jesus Christ. And he is the authentic man, and he is the authentic human person, and he is the GOAT. Yes. He is the greatest of all time.
And the only.
Guys, it's been really great having you on the show today. Yeah, the only one. You're right. I want to thank you for your humility and vulnerability in sharing the cross and the resurrection that married life is destined to be. Something that draws us out of ourselves for the benefit of our best friend in this life. And that leads to eternal life with everybody's best friend in heaven, who's Jesus. I want to close with a famous quote from Pope St. John Paul II. The body and the body alone, as we said before, alone is capable of making visible that which is truly invisible. The self-giving love of God in the world. If you want to contact Emily directly, you can get to her on her website at emilykWhiting.com or on Facebook and Instagram. I'm sure that if you want to reach out to Dan, he would probably respond to something on that as well. Please share this podcast, give it a rating, leave a comment, and if you would like to invite me to speak at an event, pick up a copy of my books, shoot me a message on social media, or go to my website at chadjudice.com. All proceeds from my writing and speaking go to fund my son Eli's lifelong medical expenses. Remember, we must boast most gladly in our weaknesses, so that the strength of Christ might be within us. When we're weak, as when we're really strong. And it takes a Good Friday to leave behind who the world says we should be, in order to rise with Jesus Christ on Easter Sunday as the person he created us to be, a saint. Until next time, God love you.
In a world that says give up, I did not yield. I gave my all for your battlefield.